Welcome back to Just Blazor Programming. Today we're going to be working on MudBlazor tables. Now, MudBlazor tables, they already have some functionality to them that I think are important for every table to have, which include pagination, sorting, and the ability to call data from server side, so you have that option in case you need it, and I'll go over that in a bit. And also just how to make a very simple table if you don't need any of this extra stuff. So, let's go over this, and I'll see you in a moment. So before we begin, you want to go to the MudBlazor.com and get the installation going if you don't have it. I have a video on it right here if you want to check it out. If not, then you can read through this documentation here and you'll be able to do the same thing either as a package on top of your Blazor project or as a MudBlazor template itself. I'm using a MudBlazor template, by the way. And in our case, we're going to be working with simple tables and tables. So these are the options that you get when it comes to MudBlazor. MudBlazor simple table is basically just a table that only shows you data, and then table is their components that actually have the ability to give you more control over how you see it. So filtering, sorting, pagination, things like that. That's on the normal table component. And if you notice that there's other things that might be tables, like data grids here, but data grid is not a table. The real difference between the two is the fact that by definition a table is basically a row column, grid basically, and that's how you show off your data, just purely by rows and columns. Data grids can be a little bit more flexible, and they have a grid which is just the actual sizing of the HTML elements. So if you ever use Bootstrap, the way that you would organize your data in the HTML through their classes or whatever, that's a grid technically. So I use them all interchangeably, and this is the only time that I've actually thought about what the difference is between a table and like a grid or whatever. And apparently that's it. So in our case, we're going to be working with simple tables and tables. Simple table is exactly what it sounds like. It's just no functionality whatsoever. So you just show data as a row column object for your client. And the table actually has our pagination, filtering, sorting right here, and the ability to have server-side rendering, essentially. So I think these are all important for you for a table, especially if you are using not just Blazor WebAssembly, but also if you're using Blazor Server. Now, obviously, the Blazor Server stuff will help you more in that case, and in other cases too, in case you run into them. But we'll go over that in a bit. For now, let's begin with SimpleTable and just get that out of the way because there's really not much to it. So SimpleTable here is just however you would do the normal table in your Blazor projects. That's how you would do it here. The only difference is that you have this MudSimpleTable component on top of it, and you would basically be controlling the actual headers and the rows as you see fit. In this case, we have a for loop, and it's just reading off a list like this through a for each, and through the for loop basically. Same thing with your with whatever's in your header, so the header columns or whatever. You will be controlling it completely. This is all HTML based. There's nothing much to it, and then it's gonna look like this. Nothing I can do here. Just very simple, basic table. It has its uses in case you don't need any of the extra stuff that you need to implement with table. So if all you need to do is have a reasonably small set of data that doesn't need any pagination or whatever, and you don't need the user to actually do anything with it or to sort through it or whatever, then this is fine enough as it is, and it will save time, development, and they'll have the functionality they need. Now, obviously, we're not here for this simple table. We're here for the big boy table, the one that actually has logic and stuff that you need, and what in my experience be most tables that I've ever built will have some variation of this. But the most important things when it comes to building tables are your filtering. If you have sorting, I haven't added the sorting yet, so it's not broken or anything, and pagination. So this is what you'll typically see with most tables that you will be building as a web developer or as a full stack or whatever. You'll have some combination of filtering, sorting, and pagination. So let's go over that now. So now let's get started on the MudTable. So between MudTable and the MudSimpleTable is that MudSimpleTable is just you using HTML and then wrapping it around a component that just gives you the stylings of MudBlazor. That's all it is with MudSimpleTable. In here, we actually have to do some work. There's some logic into it. There's some elements that you have to add in a collection. So that's where you put everything in. You have to have this in some sort of collection. This is how it works for most third-party libraries that have some sort of table component that already have some logic in there. And the most important things for a table to have, in my opinion, are going to be pagination, sorting, and filtering. Those are the three basic things that most people have seen on a table. And if you get these three things on your table, you're basically fine. And everything else that MudBlazor offers you is kind of just, window dressing, in my opinion. So if you want to learn about more of the CSS stuff, then they have documentation there. But I'm just going to go over the actual functionality. So in this case, the most important things for our table to have is this collection of elements. So in our case, I made the elements they have in their example, I've just turned it into a class, and they're all strings. So when it comes to filtering and when it comes to sorting, it's going to be based off of the string, alphanumeric, whatever the default filtering is. Speaking of, we're going to go into the filter function in a moment. So that's how filtering is done through this delegate here. And then we have our sorting, which is done through the actual headers. So in their header content component, you have something called the MudTable sort label. And here's where we actually implement the sorting. And we have some control over it, but not a lot of control. I haven't found a good way of doing customizable sorting yet. But when I do, I'll make a video about it so you can have like more control over it if you need be. And then finally, the pager content. Pager content, it doesn't seem like there's much control over it in this case. You just have it here and it will handle it for you. So there's not much to go over it here in this particular example. So what I have here is I just removed their JSON async. For this example, I just added two hard-coded objects. There's not much of a difference here when in this case, because we're going to be, we want to look at the other, we're going to look at the filtering and the sorting and stuff. And our sorting, the way way they implement their sorting is that whenever you have empty in the spacebar, so if I went here, like if I were to filter, let's say, just as a test element, it removes everything that does not have an element in something in one of the columns or whatever. If I were to go to press backspace and press enter, it puts back everything essentially. So it returns true for everything and returns false for whatever is not there. And there is a priority here in their function where they have the sign is the first priority. So if this matches the sign, it'll put true. If it matches the name, it'll put true. And then after that, it will try to look for number element position that contains this. So it's doing essentially, it cares about the sign as this first priority, then the name, then everything else. And it lumps it all together in the final statement. So that's how they're handling it. You don't have to handle it this way, but you have some control over this filtering and how you want to do it. And then they decided to have this way of doing it here in this particular order. I will say that it's kind of nice to have this in your tables just as a UI kind of client intuitive thing. Having the ability to backspace to press enter and then having the whole table come out once again showing everything. That's something that sometimes is missed by some people, but that is a really nice thing to have. And actually, this is how a lot of the custom third-party tables work. So you have to implement it in your case, but it's not very hard to implement. And now we're going to go into the sorting. So sorting is done by a component called MudTable sort label. So I'll show you that I have it working. So for this case, these are the molars. Everything here is a string, by the way. So even though these are numbers, they'll be sorted like a string. There's only two things here that are being added for clarity. And then I have the same name here, so I'm not expected to do much. And finally here. In this case, for you to do the sorting, it's going to do sorting by whatever the object is. In this case, it's a string. So it will do the sorting by whatever the default is of how you do a sorting. And unfortunately, you don't have much control over it from what I can tell. What you can control is whether or not you can sort. So you can control that through a Boolean and through this parameter called enabled, which is what this is down here that I have. Don't worry about any of these. We're not going to go over them. They're just how to actually make the table look in a certain way. But that's not too important. And then the direction of the sort. So you have some options when it comes to this. You have ascending, descending, and no direction. which is, I think, like an unsorted kind of in the unsorted option. So ascending and descending, ascending being that, you know, I think the numbers go up, and then descending is numbers go down instead. Listen, don't quote me on this. I haven't looked it up, but I know that you can control just the initial directions, and you don't have much control over the sorting otherwise. So that does kind of suck. But if you could have a function like this, I do believe you can do custom sorting. It's just that they don't have it implemented within their MudTable sort label component. Boy, oh boy, that's a mouthful. And then finally, you have your row template that has the actual data labels. So these data labels, I believe, is what will be the sortings we can be based off of. So you're looking for whatever is the value here, and then it's going to have like the name of the row here. So if I go to here and here, you'll see that the data label has the sign or whatever. So this is to match the actual column that it's in. So that's how this will keep track of it. And again, a lot of these third-party tables have something like this to keep track of the names. So they could do whatever logic it has to do in the background. And if you need to start playing with the logic, this is another avenue of how to play with it. But to go deeper into the table component, I haven't gone that much deeper into it, apart from doing the filtering and sorting and paging. And in paging's case, there's not much to it here. So again, I'm trying to find a good way of doing the sorting. If you have a good way of doing that, let me know. I'll make a video about it, give you credit, all that good stuff. But for now, you only have the default sort. The filtering you have the most control over, which is nice. And you make sure you bring back this collection of IEnumerables. Now, let's go over some server-side stuff, or how to handle server-side tables with MudBlazor. So we're going to be working on the server-side version of our table. So what you saw before this is how to handle all the items on the client side. So how to handle a table using just the client side logic. So in that case, basically your table is being loaded, is being front loaded with all the data, and then you're doing all the logic in the client side. So all the filtering, sorting and stuff is basically done within the MudBlazor component on the browser. In this case, we're doing server-side filtering, which means that all that stuff is done in the back end, and then all the data is brought forth onto the table already pre-sorted, filtered, and everything you needed beforehand. But that also means that you'll be making an API call every time you change the table, including filtering, sorting, and then try filtering here, sodium. There's only one. So every time I do an action like this in order to change the table, I am making a server call. And in their case, all they did here was mimic how this looks like, because everything is being done here within this class. And essentially what we have here, apart from this delay, is that all your data is being filtered according to whatever it is that you're adding here. All that's being passed into this function, the server reload function that they have here. And then at the end of the day, we're getting back a list that the table is going to be using, along with the page data. So along with this data here, the amount of items here, and along with the actual items themselves to be shown on the table. But all the work was being done in the back end, as opposed to the client side, where you just bring the items first and then you do all the logic. So that will require you to do that, have an API call every time you make a change. And you're not bringing back all the data, you're just bringing back the already sorted data. But because you're bringing back this information here, the user thinks that all the data is being sorted, and to them, technically this is true. You'll always have access to this data, but just not on the client side. And you'll always have the, in this case, if you have the paging here, you'll see the total number of elements that there is within this list, but you'll only have access to whatever is it that you see. Because for server side, well, you have to handle everything else. So you have to handle the actual data snippet that you're giving back, and whatever the paging is going to be. So so you're doing a lot more work here than you will be doing in the client side. But the reason why you would go down this path is, number one, if your architecture is server side, so you will have to deal with, mostly server side applications and stuff. So When I say application, I mean the application of a component. So this lends to your architecture. The other time you have to use a server side table is if there's either too much data that it can't be all applied at once on the client side, or if the HTML does not render correctly because of the complexity of the data you're bringing back or the amount of it, which can happen, especially with these third-party libraries. In my experience, these third-party libraries will basically build out your HTML for you, and will have all this logic, and will have all this stuff all built out so that you don't have to, right? However, that does take memory, takes space on the browser. And if you make it too much data comes in, or if the HTML is too complex and it's doing a lot of work, that can cause the HTML to stop rendering or to break at some point. And a way around it is by using a server-side table like this, so that first the HTML shell is brought about, and then the server side will be able to limit the amount of items that you want to show to the user. Yes, the main drawback is that every time you do a change, you're making an API backend call. But in exchange for that, you have basically, you're able to serve more data in the long run, and you're able to serve the user with something a little bit more optimized than having everything on the client side and then having that try to figure out with all the data in there. However, that's only in the cases where you run into the rendering issue, if this is going to be something that you're worried about, or if your architecture is server side, and then you find this to be, logically consistent with what you're trying to do. So in this case, unlike the client-side table, there's no items like list here. There's only the server data that you're bringing back, which is gonna take the place of all that. And the filtering, there's really no filtering here, according to this, because you're bringing back all the you're bringing back anything that you want to bring back. The filtering, the sorting, all that stuff is being brought back to the server, and then the server is going to handle everything. So that's why there isn't like a filtering specific thing here. But in order to bring all this back, you do need this server reload. You need the table data object, which is what you're bringing back ultimately. And then within here, you're bringing back the list of data, which is these items. So even though there isn't an item specific parameter in this component, the server reload will handle both sides of it basically. And this items is what you will see here. And the total items is what you will see here, down here at the bottom of the page. So the user will only ever have access to the number of items that you brought back down here. But they'll think that they're having access to all these other items, which technically they do have access to, but it's just not on the page yet until they do another reload, which is doing another change or whatever. So that's how the server piece works. It's more complicated to implement than the client-side piece, admittedly, because you are now the one that has to handle all the sorting, filtering, and paging, and then bring back the object pre-sorted, pre-filtered, and all that stuff. But it is an option that you have, and if you're using something that you want to keep consistent with your server-side architecture, that's one thing. Or if you run into a problem with the client-side items, there's too many items, the rendering doesn't render, too well. The browser breaks at some point because of this, the data complexity or the data amount. Then server-side is a good option for you, because you will be able to essentially bring all that. You'll be able to bring down that issue to just whatever the limited scope of items you want to bring. So that's why you would use server-side table rendering, and that has been my experience. And I have run into these problems in the past and had to implement server-side rendering before in other third-party libraries, and they all basically handle it the same way, from what I've known. So basically, that you handle everything in the backend, and then you bring back the pre-sorted, pre-filtered items, so that the user has access to them, and then you'll be making an API call every time they change it. So that might not sound great, but trust me, it is a good solution to if you run into this problem with the client-side stuff, because if not, you're kind of SOL and you have no other options. Server-side, don't be scared of it. It's really just trying to pre-filter, pre-sort all data and bringing it back, and then just making sure the user knows where they are in the list and then how much is in that list. That's what it is. And they already have all that for you written here, basically, so you know how to essentially apply it. Even if you have never worked with like an array like this before, it's a lot more intuitive than you think. So you're just basically telling it where I am on the page, how much is here, and then bring back the list of items that matches whatever your conditions are. And that's it. Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you do, please give me a like and subscribe. Maybe check out this next video here. Maybe sort of. Also, I have a free Blazor cheat sheet for you. I worked very hard on it, and it's just basically condensing everything that Microsoft Docs would tell you that you might need for your next Blazor project.